Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name's Carl Trueman, and I'm here with my usual co-host, the Reverend Todd Pruitt. I'm a professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College in beautiful western Pennsylvania. And Todd is pastor of a PC congregation, Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Todd, you're wrapped up a little bit warmer than usual.
Yeah, I'm indoors with a hoodie on. It is very cold here in the Shenandoah Valley. One of the things I love about living here is our weather is relatively mild compared to other places I've lived in, but we can get a little chilly. When I left my house this morning, Wednesday mornings are always really early because I meet with a group of guys from my church for study, and walked outside, and it was 5 degrees and it was windy, and so that was pretty brutal. And I still haven't gotten over it. So unfortunately, you're not going to see my bare arms.
And for European listeners, we should specify that's 5 degrees Fahrenheit, not 5 degrees Celsius.
Exactly.
That's around about minus 14, minus 15 right. Celsius.
Now, if we did this over YouTube so that our listeners could actually be viewers, then I would oblige, take off the hoodie and let people see me in a sleeveless t-shirt, because I know that that's kind of the demand.
That is your trademark.
Yeah, and the expectation, and I know that people would be disappointed if they didn't see my arms and all of my taa,
of course,
up and down my arms.
A good PCA pastor.
Right. So, but anyway, I figured since it's just us, I'll bundle up indoors.
Excellent. Except, of course, it isn't just us. We actually have a special guest today. His name is Tom Rudelius. He is an expert in an area about which I can honestly say absolutely nothing whatsoever.
Yeah. I can read what it is, but I can't understand it.
Very, very impressive resume. He completed his undergraduate work at Cornell, earned a doctorate in physics at Harvard, and has conducted postdoctoral research at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He then finished up as a postdoctoral researcher in theoretical physics at the University of California in Berkeley, and is now teaching at the University of Durham in my own home country of England. Tom, great to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks a lot for having me.
It's a great pleasure. And we got you on because you've written a very interesting book, Chasing Proof, Finding Faith. And what you do in that book, of course, is wrestle with the classic traditional dilemma between faith and science. And yet you do so from a position of both frontline engagement and tremendous learning. Maybe we could start off with just a very simple and straightforward question. Why is it that the question of the relationship between faith and science is such a perennial and prickly issue? Why is it something that people have wrestled with for many, many generations now?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say for everyone, certainly, but I guess what I found in my own experience, first of all, coming from a rather non-religious background and coming to faith later in life, while I was also becoming a scientist as well. Something that I think for a lot of people, they tend to view science and faith as sort of these two opposite, diametrically opposed approaches to the same questions about the world. And I think something that I've found from actually walking the journey of faith and actually walking the journey of science is that for me, the way that I think about religious faith and the way that I think about my science are actually very similar. That I would say that I take very similar approaches to what are often very different questions.
Could you give us an example of that? I think that's a very interesting point, but it'd be good to illustrate it for the listeners.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, for example, as a scientist, I think there's sort of this misconception that science just deals with brute facts and that it just gives us perfect knowledge about the world. But especially on the cutting edge of research, what I'm often dealing with are sort of imperfect studies, right? There are imperfect arguments, imperfect calculations that rely on certain approximations. There's experimental data, which, like all experiments, has error bars, and so there's some level of uncertainty. And so there's a lot of kind of trying to weigh the pros and cons, trying to weigh the arguments for one thing versus another, and ultimately coming to the position that I think makes the most sense. And the position where I'm going to devote my time, right? Like, I don't want to waste my time on calculations that I think aren't going to go anywhere, or theories that I think are wrong. So there's this balancing act of trying to weigh all the evidence and make the right assessment. And I think that's very, very much the same for how I approach, any question of religious faith, any question of theology, like the most basic questions of, is there a God, and what does he want from me? Where I think that, and this is a lot of what my book is about, is kind of weighing these different arguments, weighing these different viewpoints, and ultimately coming to this conclusion that I think that the Christian God makes the most sense of the world.
Most thoughtful Christians will say upfront, without any hesitation or embarrassment, look, we as believers, we have certain presuppositions as we look at the world, as we interpret the things that we see and hear. We have presuppositions. Now, we think those presuppositions make really good sense. We believe those presuppositions are entirely coherent with anything that science, so to speak, would affirm. So we deny, there's kind of, we think that the kind of a pristine neutrality is a myth, and that having presuppositions is not a negative thing. But the same is true of everybody. Everybody has certain presuppositions, and that includes every science, and science not being a monolith. What if this isn't too broad of a question? Certainly, every scientist approaches his or her work with certain presuppositions about how the world will work, and that affects how certain evidences or phenomena are interpreted. How might we understand that in terms of the scientific fact? And here I'm talking about the hard sciences, but is there a role that presuppositions play in the work of, say, physics?
Yeah, I think that there definitely is, and again, especially at the cutting edge. So often the stories you hear about the successes of science are kind of, in some ways, the rare moments, right? The rare moments where, like, just this overwhelming data came in, and this one theory was, like, shown to be true beyond any shadow of a doubt. Yeah. But it seems that, I would say, far more often where we are actually at in research, right, is not like looking into the things that we are absolutely 100% convinced about. It's often looking in these gray areas where people's prior beliefs and their prior assumptions really come into play. And I've seen in my field, some really impassioned debates over certain questions. And I think what you kind of realize when you start to sit down and think about why are these two people arguing like this, it's because a lot of them are just bringing in different presuppositions. They're bringing in different priors and different prior probabilities that they can look at the same data and come to very different conclusions.
Right.
And I think even more generally, from science, there's sort of there's a movement which I'm very much against, to sort of just treat all of metaphysics and philosophy as like a branch of physics, and to try to reduce everything that we can know about the world to this physical picture of reality. But I think even the way that science is done itself, ultimately we need philosophical assumptions about how our world works and how it operates, so that even the very foundation of science itself relies on suppositions and philosophical assumptions.
Yeah. How did your kind of prior agnosticism, perhaps prior to belief, prior to conversion, how was that? How did that start to crumble? What were kind of the main factors that really challenged your prior unbelief, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So, well, at a personal level, I think probably the most important thing that happened was that my twin brother became a Christian. We were both freshmen in college at the time. I was at Cornell. As you mentioned, he was at Northwestern. And largely through conversations with some Christian guys that he met there at Northwestern, he came to faith and he started talking with me about it. And, I think at the time, if you'd asked me like what I believed, I would have said, I'm probably agnostic. I don't think too much about it. And just, I consider myself a scientific person, and I probably would have mumbled something about that. But the thing is, I guess, looking back, what I kind of realized is I had sort of like diffused into a certain worldview without even recognizing that it was a worldview. That things like, people should be good, the goal of religion is to help us live happy and moral lives. That I had come into it with a lot of these assumptions that I had gotten from my upbringing. And it was really through those conversations with my brother that I was challenged to recognize that, hey, I actually do have a worldview after all. Like I might not call myself religious, but I bring a worldview to the table. And when I started to actually have some of the assumptions questioned about, why is there good at all? Why be good? Does good even exist? Why do I think that science points me against religion? Right? When I started having a lot of those questions, a lot of those assumptions questioned, I started to realize that, I have a worldview and it's maybe actually not the most reasonable one. And that's when I really started looking into Christianity, and a lot of things started to change for me.
Now, you say in your book that you struggled with doubt, and even perhaps we might say with anxiety, almost sort of mental health kind of issues. How has that affected your faith? How has that played into your understanding of Christianity, your experience of the gospel, Tom?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'll say a few more words about that experience. It's something that kind of it came up a few years after I came to faith, and has occasionally come up and lasted for months at a time. Are these sort of obsessive doubts that have, as you say, that I would really now call anxiety, and I would distinguish that from the sort of doubts that I still have, right? Like right at this moment, I'm not sort of obsessively questioning my faith, but there are still things that are mysteries to me. There are still things that I don't really understand, and I would like to understand better. But I think something that I really learned from going through those moments of really crippling doubt to the point of anxiety is that I've come to recognize that I think the sort of faith that God calls me to and calls all of us to is a lot more than just intellectual affirmation in the key tenets of Christianity. Because in those moments of doubt, there'll be 1 hour where you ask me, like, what do you think are the odds that Christianity is true? And then you ask me the same question another hour later, and it might have changed drastically, right? That I'm kind of in this moment, the season of just like being tossed and turned by the waves, as far as what I actually think. And to the point that I don't even know if I can trust myself, because my brain is I'm so anxious. I'm having these clearly irrational doubts that I just don't really know if I can even trust what I'm thinking. But I think that what God really wants from us in those moments, and I know many people, even since I wrote the book, have reached out to me with similar experiences. I think what God really wants from us in those moments is that we would give him our allegiance, even in the midst of our doubts. And I think that that's the sort of faith that God really calls us to, is the sort of faith that says, that God, I will take your side, even against the doubts, that I will choose to give you my life and to follow you, even if I'm questioning. And so I think that's something that stayed with me, even to these moments of where I'm not quite as anxious, God obviously, I think, cares about the intellect. And as a scientist, I think there's a lot of value in that. But ultimately, God is not just a question to be solved, like another physics problem or math problem. ultimately God is someone that we can have a relationship with. He's someone that we are called to worship and obey.
It's interesting. What you've described there is very similar to Martin Luther's experience. Martin Luther has these things. The German word is Anfechtungen, which doesn't really translate easily into English. It's sort of angst-ridden, doubts, causing anxiety. And it's often said that if Luther was around today, he'd be diagnosed as a depressive of some kind. That what he really struggles with is a form of depression. And I certainly think that that's quite likely the case. But the way you describe, as you were describing your experience there, and then you came through and were talking about really about God for us, not dependent upon the strength of our faith, but God being for us. That is quintessential Luther. So I love that statement, Tom. Always love anything that resonates with Luther.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting to me. One of the things that was interesting to me is you talk about how your unbelief was starting to crumble as claims of the Bible, claims of Christianity, were making sense to you. So there was this rational side of it. You're weighing evidence. You're looking at it, which is obviously a part of our faith. But you also mention, the conversion of your twin brother, which lends itself to perhaps some more ineffable type of influence, and something that, and isn't that the way it is with faith? On the one hand, there are things that make absolute sense. They seem to cohere with reality, et cetera, et cetera. But there's this ineffable side that ties into things like relationships and people's witness and that sort of thing. I wonder if you could describe just kind of the weightiness that you felt in seeing your brother converted.
Yeah. And I think this kind of ties into what you were saying before, this idea that there's no such thing as like the unique one, like objective, rational observer, right? I think that's something that I've really experienced in my journey to faith, where on the one hand, there was this intellectual component of looking into the arguments and learning far more about religion and God and Christianity than I'd ever known before. On the other hand, there was also this experience of being with my twin brother and seeing the ways that his life changed. And I think it's even difficult for me to really completely pinpoint as I look back at how I came to faith, of like what fraction of this was just purely intellectual and what fraction of this was experiential. And I don't think that's even really the right way to think about it. That really, at the end of the day, what happened to me is that my experiences changed, and they changed me, and they changed my outlook on the world. So I wouldn't say that I was, like totally irrational necessarily for believing what I did back before I came to faith. I just hadn't seen as much of the world, and I hadn't experienced as much of my brother or myself. And then it was this combination of learning about this God and reading these books that Steve gave me, but then also living new experiences that all of a sudden the Christian worldview made sense out of what I had experienced.
What advice would you then give, Tom, to somebody, a non-Christian who's not particularly overtly hostile and is interested in thinking about the faith? What advice would you give to that person? What book would you recommend they read, other than the Bible, of course? I mean, that's the obvious one. But how would you approach a sort of evangelistic opportunity, given your background, given your expertise, given your experience and your struggles? How would that play into a sort of personal evangelistic moment?
Yeah, well, I'm going to give one book recommendation and then one sort of piece of advice, I guess. So in addition to the Bible, as you said, the very first two books that I read, the first ones that my brother gave me were the Bible, specifically the New Testament, and a book called Letters from a Skeptic by Gregory Boyd and Edward Boyd. And the premise of the book is that it's just an actual correspondence between a pastor named Gregory Boyd and his father named Edward Boyd. And you read it, and I read it as a skeptic, and you read the father of the skeptics, Edward's letters, and you really kind of resonate with all the objections that he have. Why would a good God allow suffering, and how could I believe in miracles in the modern world? And then I would read Greg's answers, and they were surprisingly well thought out. I didn't necessarily believe everything he said, but it was I think it was really encouraging to realize that, the Christians had thought about all of these questions too, that like smart people had thought about it. And so for me, I think that was a really good book to start. And I would say that that's a great place to start if you or just kind of would like to maybe learn more. I think the other thing that is really important is for me, I don't think I probably wouldn't have come to faith, or at least not nearly as easily, if I didn't have my twin brother guiding me. And so I do think that really having a community, like checking out our church, finding some Christian friends. I think that looking back, a lot of what I believed about Christianity was a bit of a caricature, like what I saw in the media, right? And like on the news or whatever, what you see of religious people versus what the experience of religious people is actually like, I think can be very different. And so I think that it's important to like find some people of faith who or who you can know and actually see how they live and talk to them and ask them questions.
Todd, you're muted. Don't know whether...
Now I'm no longer muted. That's one of my top pieces of counsel I give to people who are struggling to believe is God uses the fellowship of his people. God uses the church. And I remember serving as a pastor in the Philadelphia area, had a young man in his late 20s reached out to me because he no longer believed. He was raised in a Christian home and actually sadly lost his faith at a Christian college in Bible classes, which is the ironic thing because he was being taught by professors who didn't believe really large portions of the Bible.
Can you just specify this isn't Grove City College?
This is not Grove City College. This is on the opposite side of the state.
Okay. Okay.
And one of the things he said was he really missed being a Christian, but that he just couldn't anymore because he just could not believe. He just couldn't bring himself to believe. And, at that point I thought, I'm not going to argue this guy into faith. He's a thoughtful, intelligent young man. And so I told him, start reading the Gospel of John and start coming to church. I said, you and I know each other now. We can talk every Sunday when you see me. He knew some people at the church. And to my surprise, he started coming every Sunday. And about 6 months later, he wrote me this fantastic letter where he had come to believe very firmly. And he said more than he ever had before. But it was wrestling through his questions, but doing so in the fellowship of believers and being under the ministry of the word. And this very intelligent, young, thoughtful man believed that way. And so, I say that because here we are, we're talking to a scientist, and the kind of prescription you gave us was read some good stuff, read your Bible, and fellowship with Christians, which any Christian can give that counsel to people, which I think is refreshing and very encouraging. Yeah.
Can I ask you one thing, Tom? We're sort of moving towards the end here, but what on earth is string theory?
I was going to.
I suspect you can't answer that adequately in 45 seconds, but if you could give us the
we can't let you go without that.
The abbreviated Wikipedia definition of string theory, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, well, string theory is called string theory because it's a theory which holds that basically everything that we see in the world around us is made up of tiny little strings. So instead of like point particles, which is how we used to think about everything, the idea is that if you actually really zoomed in, what looked like a point would actually be extended in one dimension, and we call that a string.
Ah, fascinating. This is why I'm not a scientist. I can read a poem, but I cannot grasp these kind of concepts.
Yeah. Well, we're glad that there are people out there working on string theory, and we're glad that there's some Christians doing it as well, and glad that I'm not the one needing to come up with answers there. So that's a good thing. Well, folks, our guest has been Tom Rudelius, and he's the author of a new book, Chasing Proof, Finding Faith. And if you will go to the Mortification of Spin website, mortificationofspin.org, you can enter to win a copy of this book, and we would encourage you to do so. And as you do, if you feel so compelled to make a gift to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals so that they can continue to provide content like this, feel free to do that. But Tom, thank you so much for being with us today. Happy about the book. Hope it does well. Of course, now that you've been on here, it'll be an instant bestseller.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Carl, that's what we do. Yeah. So, thanks, Tom, for being here, and we wish you all the best.
Yeah, thanks, guys. A lot of fun. Yeah.
You bet.
Thanks.
Okay.
To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to Mortification of Spin, and we will look forward to being with you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.